I'm Betsy Peterson, the director of the American Folklife Center in the Library of Congress. And for those of you who are new to the library, I want to give you a little bit of background. The American Folklife Center was established in 1976 to both present and preserve folklife. And by that, I mean the traditional cultural practices and expressions relating to music, dance, craft, and food, as well as oral traditions such as storytelling from across the world and throughout the US. And for almost half a century now, AFC staff has been working to present cultural traditions to the public through our many concerts, lectures, and related programs as a means of raising awareness about the rich diversity and importance of folklife. But we also preserve folklife on behalf of the public through our extensive archives and educational programs, as well as by supporting research and documentation projects focused on living cultural traditions and their communities. The Center's archives of traditional culture is the largest in the world, with over 6.5 million items. Archival collections range from some of the oldest sound recordings of Native American languages and spiritual music ever recorded, dating back to the 1890s, to more recent documentation of a wide array of cultures and traditions, including from West Virginia. So today, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this final event of our Homegrown Foodways in West Virginia film series, a live discussion and audience Q&A with the series producers and the participants. Over the past several weeks, from August 18th to September 15th, we've been treated to 4 beautiful films that explore a range of food traditions, or what is often called foodways, in the state of West Virginia. And in order of the premieres, which took place on the AFC's Facebook page, the films are Foraging and Relations with Dr. Jonathan Hall, Kimchi Fermentation with Marlon McClendon, Ravioli and Sauce with Lou Mayuri, and Turkish Cuisine and Seed Keeping with Mehmet Ozan. And I'm happy to say that today we have Jonathan, Marlon, and Mehmet here with us. I should also note that if you missed any of the premieres, we will be posting the film links in the chat for you, and as well as I'm sure we'll be sharing other links with you, but you can bookmark and watch them later. To produce the Homegrown Foodways series in West Virginia program, the AFC has been fortunate to team up with the now former West Virginia State folklorist, Emily Hilliard, and the chefs, farmers, and filmmakers, Mike Costello and Amy Dawson of Lost Creek Farm. The couple make their home on a farm that's been in Amy's family for several generations. And the beautiful farm includes fields of sorghum and Bloody Butcher corn, heirloom vegetable beds, free-range chickens, rabbit hutches, grazing Hereford cattle, and a heritage apple orchard in the north central part of the state. Mike and Amy operate a traveling kitchen, or as they sometimes call it, a culinary roadshow, celebrating and sharing West Virginia foodways with audiences local and afar. And they produce the popular Pickle Shelf Radio Hour podcast. And as reflected in each of the films of this series, they guide us into the stories they've learned from elders, farmers, cooks, foragers, hunters, and other foodways practitioners of the diverse cultural communities in the Mountain State. And as Emily has written in her guest AFC blog posts over the past few weeks, many of the histories of foodways traditions can be traced in the center's own West Virginia collections. And I invite you all to check them out on our website, or please come and visit us once we're open to the public again. But in the New River Gorge Folklife Project collection, which was documented from 1991 to 1993, folklorist Mary Hufford and Rita Moonsamy documented diverse cultural practices of communities embedded within and surrounding the New River, which was at the time a national river and now is the country's newest national park. They conducted interviews with vegetable gardeners, hunters, and fishers, restaurateurs, a former railroad crew cook, herbalists, and many more. In addition, in the Coal River Folklife Project collection, Mary Hufford documented the still pervasive foraging, hunting, fishing, gardening, and preservation practices in the Big Coal River Valley from 1992 to 2000, which was a period of great ecological disruption. Through interviews with home cooks and canners, ginseng diggers, grape and berry pickers, morel or Molly Moocher mushroom foragers, fishers, and hunters, she records how these land-based traditions have been affected by climate change and industry, particularly timber and mountaintop removal mining. I know Emily will be talking a bit more about these important collections, as she received in 2018 an American Folklife Center Parsons Fund Award to spend time in the center's archives to research sound recordings, photographs, field notes, and ephemera related to the state during your time directing the West Virginia Folklife Program, which is based in the West Virginia Humanities Council. Finally, before we begin, I do need to thank AFC and library staff who have made this series possible from behind the scenes. It definitely takes a village to make these things happen. And I want to give special thanks to AFC staff, Michelle Stefano, Thea Austin, John Fenn, Steve Winnick, Stephanie Hall, Jennifer Cutting, and Ebony Skurlock. And I also want to thank library staff, Glenn Ricci, Tom Nauer, Elizabeth Schreiber-Beyer, and all the folks in the office of the Chief Information Officer who helped get us our virtual programming coded and ready for broadcast. I have one last housekeeping note, and that is that you submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Michelle and Thea will try their best to ensure that they are posed to participants during the Q&A period later. And so without further ado, I am going to turn everything over to Emily, Amy, and Mike, who will be introducing our guests, Dr. Jonathan Hall, Marlon McClendon, and Mehmet Otzan, and leading a discussion for the first 45 minutes on the traditional knowledge and food practices they have shared with us in their films. So again, thanks so much for coming, and welcome, Emily, Amy, and Mike.
Thanks so much, Betsy. Thank you for having us here today, and to everyone who helped make this panel and this series possible. So like Betsy said, I'm Emily Hilliard. I am now with Mid-Atlantic Arts as Program Officer in Folk and Traditional Arts with a focus on our Central Appalachia Living Traditions program. And we supported the series that was produced by Mike Costello and Amy Dawson of Lost Creek Farm with our amazing participants, Marlon, Jonathan, Mehmet, and Lou. And I think to start, Mike and I and Amy are going to talk about some of the goals that Mike and Amy had for the series and what we talked about when we started discussing the project. And then we'll have our participants introduce themselves, and then Mike and I have some questions for each of them, particularly focused on some of the themes that came up across the different films. So I thought first we could start hearing from Mike and Amy about their goals for the series when we came to them with this project, and the common threads that emerged across them intentionally, and then that just came up over the course of filming and producing the series.
Yeah, well, thanks, Emily, and thanks to everybody else for joining us, and to the AFC crew for having us today. Yeah, it was such an interesting opportunity to get to work on this series because over the years, Amy and I have sort of, we get kind of picked out from time to time to sort of represent Appalachian food or West Virginia food, you know, whatever that is. And I think that point of it can sometimes be problematic because there is not necessarily a definition, a concrete definition of what Appalachian food means. I mean, you could say it's a lot of things. It could be, traditions of people who have been here for a very, very long time, people who were here first. There were many indigenous communities that get overlooked. And when we talk about who gets to be Appalachian, you could say it's food that was made from recipes that were grown here. And, my answer is sort of like, it's maybe a little bit of all those things, but there's not really a definition. And when we get sort of sought out to represent West Virginia or Appalachian food, we have a story to tell of our own, as everybody does, but there's a tendency to kind of, reduce this idea of identity to something that is often, white for one, and sort of there are a lot of other things that kind of fit the trope or the stereotype of about what Appalachian food is, and therefore what Appalachian culture is and who Appalachian people are. So for us, as practitioners in Appalachian food, we are also storytellers, and through the stories is sort of where we, again, we don't really try to define it, but it's sort of where we can find the sort of meaning to people of what connects food to place. So, we have in our participants in the film series, these are 4 people who are very good friends of ours who have, very sort of inspiring stories to us. They're very close members of our food community. And, their stories are compelling stories about carrying on food traditions, but also connecting it to place in a way that is often challenging to the way that people often think about Appalachian food. Right?
Yeah, and we specifically picked these 4 individuals, one, because we admire and respect them and their commitment to food practices. We've connected with all 4 of these individuals through food in a very meaningful way. And we tried to pick 4 stories that explored a very diverse range of experiences. We had 2 people who were born and grew up in West Virginia, and 2 people who came here from somewhere else. And our goal in choosing 4 diverse individuals were to highlight the diversity, that there are differences. But it's funny because we did, in telling all 4 of the stories, we did find that they were all very, very similar stories. And that just goes to show the human experience is the same everywhere. And so from, wanting to feel like you belong, wanting to connect to a place, and wanting to feel sort of a familial connection. And also mothers were a big theme throughout all 4. And so in that way, it was a good diversity, but a common story.
Yeah, and I think another interesting point is that we are connected to all these 4 people through food, but this was special for us as professionals and as chefs to get to sort of highlight what West Virginia food means as like as storytellers to people who are not professional chefs or professional cooks or food businesses, because those are the people who often get sought out to sort of represent the culture of a place, is like people who do it professionally. But the culture is so different, and the experience, like, it is so different for everybody, and a lot of that culture really shows up in the home. One thing I find very interesting is that 2 of these people, Marlon and Lou, we have known for a very long time, and we initially connected to them not at all through food, and we sort of remain friends. And over the years, it sort of comes out that everyone has these kind of compelling food stories, and I think that is a very sort of important takeaway. is that we often think about the people who have food stories as being, food people, like, professional cooks or people who are, very skilled and practiced and, have these sort of, hobbies or whatever it is, as a prolific gardener or a hunter or whatever. But I think it goes to show that that is very, very common. A lot of people have a food story that connects them to place.
Yeah, I think that's one point that is very folk life oriented, that there's a focus on home cooks and food waste practitioners that are part of cultural communities but aren't necessarily professional chefs. But someone who's coming to this from the food media world might not expect to see home cooks and practitioners and seed keepers, especially with the direction, food media has gone on a mainstream level, where there's this real focus on celebrity chefs. But from a folk life standpoint, we do focus on these, cultural communities and home-based practitioners. I was talking to an herbalist in West Virginia and asked her what her vision was for herbalism, the tradition in the state. And she said, an herbalist in every home. And she said, that might be strange, but it's not unusual to think about how we have a cook in every home. And I think that's one reason why foodways traditions persist. Many cultural communities, immigrant communities, lose other traditions, music and dance, but food generally is one that persists because it is so, it's part of everyday life. It's part of daily life and family life. So I think that's a really important point. Mike and Amy, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, especially people who might not be from the region or familiar with the region, what are some important points in Appalachian food and important themes? I know it's really difficult to define because of this diversity and breadth of practice, but also what does that sense of regionalism offer and allow us to examine, but what might that idea of Appalachianness, how does that present a barrier and how can it also exclude?
Yeah, this is a really good question to sort of think about, how we would approach a series like this, because I think the sort of idea of Appalachianness and Appalachian food is often not defined by people in West Virginia, and the sort of legitimacy of Appalachian food is not defined in West Virginia or in Appalachian. I think that in the context of food, a really, recent and obvious example of this is sort of in the commercial food world, there has been this sort of touted food trend by food media, but what that has done, a lot of people think that creates all these great opportunities for us who are here on the ground. But I think what it has done more often than not is sort of create this desire for a very narrowly focused, rather stereotypical image of, what Appalachian food means, and in turn, who gets to be Appalachian. Because when you are talking about the food of a people or of a place, you were talking about that culture and you were talking about those people. So, when Amy and I, when we go on the road or when we put on events here and we tell these stories, this is exactly why we, we'll tell stories about the Lebanese communities throughout West Virginia, or, the Black communities, or the historic immigrant communities and the new immigrant communities, because Appalachia has always been sort of evolving, and it's always been this place where people are coming and going. So, how that shows up in food is also this, ever-changing story. And I think that a commonality that we saw in this series was that, when people settle in a different place, whether that's, 100 years ago as part of a well-established by now immigrant community like the Italian American community, or they came to West Virginia just a few years ago. In Mehmet's case, there's still this desire to use food as a way to connect to a place that's maybe outside the region, right? But you're also using food to connect to and establish a home where you are here. So I think, the meaning of Appalachian food and of Appalachianness is not necessarily for us to define. It's like everybody sort of has their own relationship with identity and their own relationship with place. And, what is our responsibility is to sort of make sure that all of those different stories are getting out there so that we have a more complete, inclusive kind of, not a definition, but sort of an idea of what Appalachianness could mean. And I think that traditionally Appalachia has sort of been portrayed in the media to the rest of the world as, basically a white space, right? So these are the things that we have to think about when we think about, what Appalachian food means. I think a lot of times it is sort of understanding, how people have this idea of Appalachia in their minds and how we might be able to challenge that. And sometimes, most often it works and people are, like, wow, I never really knew that, there were not like people other than Scots Irish people in West Virginia, right? But then sometimes we'll put on a dinner in a place like DC, and people will come up to us afterwards and they'll be like, wow, I don't know that I like this because like I thought I was coming here for Appalachian food and you serve this like Spanish sausage, and that's not Appalachian, that's Spanish. And at first it kind of like it irks me that people have that reaction, but then it usually starts a conversation of like, well, okay, there were these Spanish communities that came here, for labor as part of an immigrant movement. They're still here, like what makes them any less Appalachian than, the people who are in your mind and who sort of get to be Appalachian. So it is a sort of a double-edged sword, like this idea of there being something that's been highly touted as Appalachian, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Appalachia is part of America, and
Right.
It's, this is a very American story of immigration and migration, and Appalachia is not exempt from that, and all those issues as well. So I think now we could have each of the panelists introduce themselves.
Right. Thank you, Emily, Amy, and Mike, and the other hosts of the film for this space and the Folk Life Center and everything. This is Library of Congress. This is really awesome opportunity to sort of share this space and to talk about, our commonalities and our unique stories. So I am an assistant professor of biology at Eastern Michigan University. So you may be wondering, like, how did I get in this space? But I used to be, as of last year, was a assistant professor of geography at West Virginia University. And so my research, my day job is doing like ecology, wildlife ecology research. So I study California condors and hunting practices and food provisioning practices in Appalachia. And so that research really came from a personal interest in, gaining more understanding and control over where my food comes from. And moving to West Virginia, moving to Morgantown now 9 years ago, I really wanted to kind of embrace what I thought, or the perception that I had about what it meant to be Appalachian, or be Appalachian, or to live in this region, which was, being self-sufficient, hunting, foraging, those sorts of things. Those are the kind of cultural ideas that I had about this region. Some of the more flattering cultural ideas that I have in the region, the less flattering ones I learned over time that were deeply problematic and not particularly true. So, it became a personal interest of mine. And through that personal interest, as is the case, with, I think, anything that people do when they pursue their interests. They seek out people with those same interests, and you build community that way. You build community around things that bring you joy, that challenge you, that teach you things. And that's how I've come to meet, some of the people here. And this has sort of blossomed into this web of relations that I've just really treasure and continue to depend on. So yeah, that's what I do.
Thank you. Marlon?
Yeah, am I unmuted? Okay, yeah. Okay, hi, my name is Marlon. I am Korean West Virginian, I guess you could say. My father's family is from Preston County, West Virginia, and my mother's from Korea. And that's important because anyways, so yeah, I'm a photographer. I do like wedding photography and portraits. And then I also do documentary stuff of motherhood, Asian American identity, and community and food. And yeah, my other job is being a mom to 2 kids. And so I mentioned the Korean American thing to say that, growing up in West Virginia, I was always asked where I was really from. And even though I was from here, I never felt like I was from here. So I kind of rejected that Korean side of myself and embraced the American side. And it wasn't until I moved to a rural area in Pocahontas County that it all kind of came full circle. I, was far away from grocery stores. I had to start learning to cook in different ways and started, caring about where my food came from. And so I started growing food. And as I became a mother, I started questioning, what's important to me, what's important to pass on to my children, what culture, what ideas, what rituals and things like that. And so as the importance of food has become more important to me, and getting in touch with my Korean side through food, I am trying to figure out a way how to pass that to my kids. And so, I've always made kimchi. I've always grown up eating Korean food, but I hadn't spent a lot of time making it and getting more in depth into it. So through gardening and things like that, I have started to make more Korean food and get more in touch with that side of myself. And in turn, passing that on to my kids. And so I guess what you guys were saying about place has been really important to me, because it's been, living next to the mountains in this rural area, attaching myself to the literal land has brought all of that back to me, embracing my Korean culture, embracing food, figuring out what I can eat in nature and putting that into my food. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Marlon. Mehmet?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Mehmet, and I came to this country in 2006, so I'm fairly new, or maybe not. I don't know. It has been 15, 16 years, and but to do my PhD in civil engineering at Michigan State University. So this is kind of wild, sitting in a panel about my food practice and the way life I think took me, thinking about it, reflecting on it is kind of wild. But anyway, so after my education, I followed my partner, who accepted a faculty job at University of South Florida in Tampa. And then prior to that, of course, beginning the first day in my of my arrival to United States, my search for food began, because that was one of the biggest and most pressing, I think, challenges for me as an immigrant, or at the time as just a student who came for his studies, to find a way to reconnect with my culture and home and family and friends. That search continued for a long time, without an access to land, because I think having that access is very crucial in terms of making that cultural connection. But then realizing after moving to Tampa, Florida, and having a small backyard, realizing that how that, you know, the land access can actually be a very refreshing and you know, significant experience that channel me, that channel someone, that can channel someone to find the direction, to find a new way about connecting, reconnecting with culture. So that's when I started gardening, and then finding out about, you know, different kinds of seeds and how traditional seeds can make that cultural connection very very uplifting. And I transitioned from my education and the engineering career into becoming a full-time farmer, eventually starting a seed company, and continuing that, you know, commuting to space and renting space for 5 years, which was a very challenging experience. But then moving to, again, making another move to West Virginia. There again, I following my partner because she got a job here, and then I came here with her, and working also at West Virginia University as a service assistant professor, who currently, you know, doesn't have a specific program, but, you know, kind of, you know, floating in those spaces across the college, basically working on programming related to food justice, not necessarily focusing on white food ecologies, but also trying to tell the stories like mine, and trying to connect with other underrepresented, marginalized food communities and people, and looking at their food traditions and working on community engagement and outreach projects. So.
Great, thank you. Mike, you want to start off with your question?
Sorry, we muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so, you know, back to the idea of sort of like who gets to be Appalachian, who gets to have the experiences that we consider Appalachian. One of the things that came up and that has really driven a lot of the conversations with Jonathan and us over the years, and sort of led to this video, is the idea of who gets to access all these places, right? Like the places, the wild spaces that, you know, we grew up sort of feeling like we have this unimpeded access to all of these places around us in rural West Virginia. But it turns out that can be a very different experience for different people. And if you watch Jonathan's video, you know a little bit about this. But Jonathan, I would like to hear sort of in your words a little bit about you know, about this experience, about having a very different sort of level of access to places where we can enjoy, you know, our wild foodways and hunt and fish and forage and all the things.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Like, I think that you know, it relates to my reluctance, and I still am reluctant to sort of identify myself as somebody who's tied to Appalachia. You know, like that's part of my identity as an Appalachian person, right? I don't consider myself that, but one of the things I've appreciated about, you know, my friendship with both of you is that you really kind of challenged that. And you talked about that today, about how, you know, Appalachia, it gets defined by the people who make community in these spaces. And it reminds me of a concept in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, about becoming indigenous to a space, right? And it has to do with the intent that you have in that space and what kind of relative you want to be. But, you know, some of you may have noticed that I'm Black. And so that means that, you know, entering into spaces, there's a baggage that comes with that, right? There's a certain set of expectations that we're all socialized into, whether or not, you know, we've been living in this country for less than 2 decades, or if we're raised in this country, right? Blackness is understood in a variety of different ways, but it is understood, and it's something that we are all exposed to, and that we all sort of take in. And so moving to an overwhelmingly white state, some of the perceptions about West Virginia being like, oh man, this West Virginia is super racist, right? Like hyper racist, because it's like nothing but white folks, and they, backwoods white folks, and all these like awful stereotypes of people that are here. And so, I think that the reality of how we understand race and Blackness to show up in spaces that are white has to be in conversation with the experiences that people who are subject to the negative consequences of these structures sort of have. And so my experience has been overwhelmingly positive compared to what I was worried about, moving to this area. But it's also been pretty fraught with the way that people are socialized to think about Blackness, right? So, when it comes to going into spaces to like hunt and forage, like I'm hyper cognizant of the people who are around me. And, it's one of the reasons why I've talked about, like, I don't hunt on public land. Just because I've never seen Black people when I've been out hunting or just sort of like driving around, like see Black people in camo who are like out there in the woods. And so, I have to think about how is a white person going to react when they see a Black person in a space that they normally don't see with a firearm. And we have all sorts of examples of people reacting with deadly consequences to even just like the threat, or not even the threat, but like the perception that a Black person has a firearm, right? And it often ends in deadly consequences for that person. So, it's something that lots of people, who look like me talk about. The Black Forager, who's one of my favorite follows on social media, talks about this all the time. And about, it's different to be out in these spaces, in the outdoors, and to have people who are socialized and grow up, white people, that this is their space, right? The great outdoors, and people walking around with like shirts that say I'm a public landowner, and everything. Like that's a cultural inheritance of whiteness that so many people of color, and especially Black people, don't have to the same degree. And so, it has shaped my experiences. But it's also brought me, I think, in close community with people who are also aware of these things and are troubled by them. And, more than just like the rhetoric of, being an ally, or the rhetoric of understanding, because it's very easy it's for some, it's very easy to sort of embody that rhetoric, but to actually act on it, right? To actually be in close community, to actually support those who, live in marginalized identities, that's a whole different thing entirely. And, I've been very fortunate because of the relationships that I've built with people, and the fact that we can like sit around the table and talk about these things. It's created a platform, and I'm really grateful for that. But I think it's, to the people who are less understanding and less aware of these things, there's a history to the way that land has been shaped, and the expectations around access that we all have a responsibility to understand, first of all. And then if we are going to say that we are advocates, if we're going to say that we're allies, if we're going to sort of drape ourselves in that identity, then we actually need to back that up with action, and build community. So it's really important.
Thanks for sharing that, Jonathan. I think an important point that maybe connects to some of the other topics in the films is the way that social circumstances affect, sometimes negatively, the transmission of cultural traditions and how they are able to be shared and experienced and accessed. And I think, Marlon, that came up in your video a little bit with this idea and your experience of food as a marker of otherness. and, you know, your experiences as a, you know, when you were in elementary school about bringing kimchi to school and kind of experiencing food as a source of shame. But then also transforming that to a point of connection, which I think is Jonathan's point too. There's opportunities for building community amidst these issues and these negative experiences around food. So do you want to talk a little bit about that idea and how, you know, those initial experiences and then how food sort of became this point of connection, both to your community in West Virginia and also your mother?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, like you guys saw in the film, you know, I grew up with my mom being the main person who cooks the food, right? So at home, we're eating a lot of Korean food. And so naturally, she, you know, puts that in my lunch and I take it to school and it smells funny and it looks funny. And so, yeah, immediately othered for that situation. And so, yeah, that kind of stuff happened a lot, not just from food, but from the way I looked. So, you know, I kind of internalized that and pushed that to the side. And so for a long time, just really didn't even think about that or food. Like I always ate Korean food, but food didn't really become important to me until I moved to this rural area and to this community in which food is important to the people here. And you're really far away from grocery stores. And so out of necessity, you know, I'm started connecting to my food and becoming more curious about where my food comes from. And once you learn about that whole system, you kind of have to, you start gardening in a lot of ways to, you know, eat in the best way that you want to. And also much like Mehmet and the eggplants, you know, there's no access to a lot of Korean food or vegetables or herbs here. So out of necessity, I've started growing those things and have, you know, connected to other people through Mehmet who are growing seeds in California and hopefully going to grow those things next year. But yeah, so, you know, moving here and then, yeah, becoming a mother. Yeah, when you become a mom, you start to, you know, think about all of the things again, what matters to you, what's meaningful. And through my own experience becoming a mother, I started thinking more about my mom's experience, like what it must have been like for her to move here at 23, Korean, to West Virginia, what that experience must have meant for her. And so, you know, I started cooking more Korean food, thinking about my mom, and just thinking about how I can pass those memories on to my kids of their ancestors, of what it means to be Korean. And so for me, that main memory is food. And so it's kind of all come back around to me making those dishes and calling my mom and, you know, looking up things on YouTube and learning how to make these foods. And then also foraging, you know, certain ingredients from Appalachia and putting those two things together. So through that fusion and the idea of passing that on to my kids, yeah, I'm sorry, that's kind of what I was trying to get there. Yeah. I don't know if you have something to add.
Oh, no, sorry. I think Mike and I
lost my train of thought there.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think one thing that's very interesting about Marlon's story, your family story, is that sort of there are two pieces of like, you know, very different but also kind of common immigration stories in West Virginia. I mean, one of those stories is that people come here sort of as part of a community. And then the other side is that people, you know, people are kind of here and rather isolated. And I think it's interesting that, you know, in your situation, there is a community of Korean women in West Virginia because of this dynamic with the American military and Korean women marrying American military men. But then also, you know, when she moves to a place like Preston County, you can feel very isolated. And Mehmet happens to live in Preston County. You know, not exactly the, you know, bustling Turkish community that you might imagine it to be, right? But no, it's but anyway, I mean, this is a totally different thing. I mean, a lot of the immigrant food traditions that we have in West Virginia are from communities, and when people like Mehmet are sort of here by themselves, they use their food traditions to build community. One way that you saw that in the video was through this oven that Mehmet built. And Mehmet, I'd like to maybe hear you talk a little bit about that process, maybe the process of how building it and using it has sort of worked, and how you hope it works to build community through your food.
Yeah, I have been thinking about this lately a lot, about, you know, how did I manage to build a community, if I did, without actually having many people, many Turkish people or people from Turkey that, you know, I could connect with, that I can speak the same language with. You know, did it happen? You know, how did that happen? Because I didn't really have a lot of connections with these people. So with people of my country, actually, other than, I think in Michigan, I was a student, so we had quite a few Turkish students there. That kind of communication and interaction happened a lot, and so, and then, you know, I'm not, I guess, you know, looking at me and then telling that if you're not talking to me, if I'm not opening my mouth and you know, starting to speak English, you may or may not be able to tell, you know, I am not an American, right? But then with me, it's usually the language, right? So because all of a sudden, you know, people who I am talking to for the first time will say, I know, you know, not everyone, but most people, oh, you have an accent, you know, where are you from? And then, unless I have the proximity with that person to respond back in differently, saying that, oh, you have an accent too. You know, unless, you know, I feel bold enough to say that, you know, to so that the conversation will not end before it begins, I say, you know, I'm from Turkey. But so, knowing this, and then being an L2 speaker of English, and then writing, you know, a dissertation in a language other than my own, you know, surviving that actually white academic space, you know, at the end of, you know, 5 years, that's one level of challenge, right? And then moving to, with my partner, to a you know, a place actually, looking back at it, not being actually that welcoming, especially to a neighborhood with an HOA, which is historically about segregated communities, right? It's deeply rooted in that. So I'm thinking about it, you know, we never actually, in meaningful ways, interacted with our neighbors back in Tampa, Florida. And why is that? I mean, because, you know, I think HOA was one of the issues, because it was a white space, mostly, except there we had a Lebanese neighbor, which we talked about food and different things, you know, like that also says a lot, right? Him being the only person that I communicated with in that neighborhood. Coming here, you know, people we are close with, my partner and I are close with, telling us, oh, are you moving to West Virginia? Oh, you know, be careful. So, and then me thinking about all these challenges that I, you know, went through in the United States, and, you know, like thinking, what, you know, what are these people talking about? Because usually these, you know, usually the reference is liberal progressiveness, right? When people make these comparisons, and then, you know, if you think about it, you know, San Francisco has a population with only 5% of its population is Black. And 56% of the incarcerated people in San Francisco is Black. So, and then Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, these places are, neighbors are racially segregated. And all of a sudden people are just worried about me moving in, to a space, which is known as racist and then full of ignorant people. So, we listen to these concerns and of course, the moving to, so a rural space was not something that I ever had done up until that moment. So that comes with some sort of anxiety. I mean, even if you're not worried about or, concerned about your neighbors around you, it's kind of a wild space, right? I mean, there's wild animals. I mean, you would be, concerned about, are there, black bears around us or, because I was reading about the state and its wild animals and such. So, I mean, that kind of anxiety there is. And then we moved into the neighborhood. There was gun practicing. That was one thing that kind of startled me and made me a little bit stressed in the beginning. But then I got over with that. I got used to that, which is, I mean, it's a rural space and people hunt. So, that was also, after a certain point was a common thing to get used to. But then getting to know, we started to get to know our neighbors and then started building a relationship and then helping each other and then in a state, especially, there's that statement, right? We West Virginians take care of each other. So, that made me think, not in a state with 95% of the population is white, who takes care of who, right? So basically me moving to that and my partner moving to that space, especially being, me part-time academic, she full-time academic, moving to that space, whereas also there's a lot of prejudice on the side of white academics about the community around us, especially with people who claim to be doing work on or around or with communities, but yet lacking a connection with these communities. It came with a lot of anxieties, but it has been a very refreshing and rewarding experience, especially, again, me moving into that neighborhood and then kind of contributing into that statement of we take care of each other and kind of taking ownership of that statement, right? So now who's taking care of who? So I think that's a very, it gives me hope because I think we have especially with one neighbor, Jonathan and Mike and Amy we have very close, very, I think, rewarding relationship where we learn from each other. And then these are the people, again, by academics and food experts, and also some nonprofits that suffer from whiteness, kind of bring up, that class relationship, and then, trying to name these people names and call them ignorant and racist and stuff like that. Our neighbors are much more understanding than, are well-educated. And education, that's a quotation, like a quote unquote well-educated friends and colleagues and such. So, and then the relationship around food and building this community oven, because we did that with our community. Our neighbors helped build that, helped us build that oven without even us asking for help. That was very interesting. It was a self-initiating process. They came to pour our concrete slab and disappeared. It was like a very interesting thing to see. They faded away and then they came back and then helped with another process. Just without us, it was very, it happened in harmony. And then timeline was very interesting too. They knew when they would come back, they would need to come back to help with a different process. Because as you can see, it's the dome is placed on a frame. So us lifting all the concrete and then pouring it to make that concrete slab would be, impossible. So neighborhood kids came, and then our neighbor came. Our neighbor used the neighborhood kids to help pour the concrete so that we wouldn't hurt our backs. So yeah, and then cooking in it, and then asking questions. I think help, have been really, really interesting, and I love it. So and then looking at different recipes, yeah, it has been very rewarding, I think.
Really beautiful oven. I think maybe Mike, since Lou is not joining us today, I thought maybe you wanted to talk a little bit about Lou and his stories, and connecting especially to the immigrant narrative. And there's some commonalities with what the themes that come up in Mehmet's video, and then Lou, even though he was born here, who is the child of Italian immigrants, and some of the commonalities there, and this idea of cultural transmission, who is passing on these traditions, and all, I think all of the videos really, mothers, as you said, was a big theme that wasn't necessarily planned. So maybe at that point we could open up to just people jumping in about that, sharing that knowledge, and also being the recipients of that knowledge. But why don't you bring in Lou a little here?
Yeah, sure. So Lou is almost 93. He'll be 93 years old in November. And he is into so many things. We actually met Lou probably 12 years ago or so through the world of music and dance. And then it was through that we got to know Lou as a gardener and a seed keeper, and he would share his heirloom beans with us. And then, through those conversations about beans, he would say, the next phase, I got to have you guys up for this ravioli. I mean, it is something that I make only a couple times a year, a very special thing. But I think that in all of those things, what Lou does very, very well is he connects all of those traditions to people, and he ensures that there's a story that goes with the seed, with the recipe, with the song or the dance that he's passing on. And and Lou has always been a person, as long as we've known him, to be very adamant that that these traditions need to be passed on, because as long as they're connected to certain people, that keeps those people alive, right? Even when they're gone, like those people kind of live on through those traditions. So this is why, for someone like Lou, it is very important for him to seek out people like Amy and I, who he can trust to keep the story going, to pass the recipe forward, to share the beans, because in doing so, even when he's not around anymore, like that piece of him, that piece of his family, that piece of his community will be preserved. And I think that so Lou in one way is very different than the other three participants, because he has sort of been here for so long. I think a lot of people could look at Lou and sort of say that he embodies a lot of what that sort of like more stereotypical idea of like what the West Virginia old timer looks like, right? He's a square dance caller, and he wears his camo ball cap, and he's got his great garden. But then you get Lou talking about his Italian heritage, and it's it's really special, because there's a lot of commonality. When his dad and mom came here in the early 1900s, that Italian American community was very much marginalized in a lot of the same ways in the labor camps. So his dad came to work on the railroads in Pocahontas County, and then he sort of moved down to where his mom had settled in the Kanawha Valley, where Italian families were mostly coal miners. But it was sort of, there was a lot of desire to connect back to, as Lou always says, like to connect back to the old country. So the way they would do that is through food, and Lou said something in the film that it was very special. It's like, this is like going back in time for a visit, when you make these recipes that his mom taught him. It is like going back and reconnecting with his mom. And that's the other special thing about Lou and his stories, is that all of it is so much more about his mom or his dad or the people who taught it to him than the actual act or the result of the recipe. And that's it's very special. So Lou is not so plugged in to be with us on a webinar today, but yeah, watch his video. He's also on our podcast mentioned. He's also on an episode of our podcast along with Mehmet. We did a seed keeping episode last year, and he's featured there too.
Yeah, I think that idea of food as a practice is really important. And I think often we think about food as a product, but approaching it as a practice, often that is embedded within community and is about connection, is something that comes up in all 4 of the films. And I'm curious to hear from the participants, having the experience of being filmed and talking about your own practice, if you had kind of moments of recognition or illumination watching the other 3 films that maybe shed light on your own work, or made you think about it in a new or different way, or see how it was a kind of commonality. You can just jump in. Maybe you didn't have that experience.
So one more time, the question. Man, I want to make sure that I get it right.
Yeah, I think like watching the other 3 films, were there moments that made you kind of recognize something in your own practice, or illuminate something that you do, make you think about it in a new way?
Yeah, I mean, I one of the things that struck me like deeply was Marlon talking about her experience of the pressures of what I perceive as whiteness on people who are not white, especially as like children, and what that does to your own sense of identity and your relationship to it, right? So this idea that, like, in order to fit in order to just like navigate these spaces, there's a compromise, there's a cost that's offered up to what are you willing to compromise and sacrifice to gain proximity to whiteness? Because getting proximity to whiteness is going to make your life easier, right? So I think it really speaks to the fact that whiteness is a structure that impacts all of us, and that from a very young age we understand this structure, right? Because we understand what's going to get us into trouble, what's going to get us isolated, what's going to get us made fun of, what's going to make us more acceptable, which, I think that we as human beings want to be accepted, like we want community. And so hearing about, your experience, Marlon, that really struck me, because for me, growing up in an affluent neighborhood in Maryland, and being one of 3 Black families that actually lived in this suburban planned community, and then going to school and being the nerdy Black kid who talked white, right? As I heard from like Black friends and people that I knew, but then was like, wait, you're in the gifted and talented class, Black kid? Like, what are you doing here? Being caught in between, the way that whiteness as normal is understood and accepted, and then trying to have to navigate that. I graduated high school not having a very good relationship with Blackness, and I've talked about this in other contexts as well. And it wasn't until I went to Morehouse College, shout out to the house, a historically Black college. Some say it's the greatest, historically Black college or college in the world. I tend to agree, but it wasn't until then that I saw a spectrum of Blackness, and really began to like accept the fact that the things that I was interested in that were not sort of legible through the white gaze of what Blackness is was okay. And so, you know, that connects, so that like strength and sense of identity really connects to my experience here in West Virginia, in coming here, and having the confidence to be like, okay, this may not be the space, these may not be spaces where I'm expected to be, but I like the taste of deer meat, and I like to challenge myself, and I like the environment. So like, why not? And why shouldn't I step into these areas? And then discovering that in the process of moving here, that my great uncle, Joseph Nickerson, started a church in Hinton, West Virginia. He and his wife and infant son at the time were in this book called Negroes of West Virginia. Like, you can go on like WVU's, you know, libraries and find this book and see a picture of my great uncle. I had no idea, but this picture was in like the back of the family reunion. So then, like, moving here and then going to Hinton and finding the site of the church and walking around, and my wife and I, and at the time our 18-month-old daughter, running into a Black woman who knew the little baby boy in that photo in that book. So oh yeah, I knew Mr. Nick. And this is my great uncle, not my great uncle, my great uncle. And you know, to see that, like, oh my goodness, yes, like we've been, like, we Black people had been here, like we've been in these spaces, we had been represented, we are Appalachian, right? We have a home here, we have a place here. But it was wild because you know, we tend to think about like spatial segregation as a thing of the past, but like driving through Hinton, and I don't know if it's still the case, but like you enter Hinton from, I don't know, one cardinal direction and sort of drive through town across river. And like we drove into Hinton, and it was like very clearly like white people that were there. We just saw white people. We saw some Confederate flags, which is always baffling to me, especially in a place like West Virginia, but you know, whatever. But then like there was almost a point in Hinton where you like saw Black people. And it was like you still had this incredible spatial segregation. And you know, this sort of these sort of legacies that exist today. But you know, I think that, you know, hearing Marlon's story and experience, I think it's something that I think a lot of us can, all of us in the films can relate to, about like the tax that is on people who do not fit in what is normative, who don't immediately fit into whiteness. How do we navigate these spaces, and what's the tax we have to pay? What's the calculus we have to pay to like remain true to ourselves, right? And while also kind of creating space where we can like survive, right? And I think we're all doing that in really beautiful and amazing ways that, you know, sort of threads the common, there's a common thread for all of our experiences in that film. So, but I seriously like got emotional when Marlon, you said that about like your experiences, because I remember feeling the same way over different things, just being like, oh, you know, I guess that's not okay. I guess I have to tone that part of myself down in order to just like make it through the day. So yeah.
Marlon, do you want to respond or chime in? I saw that you were unmuted.
I was just unmuted in case I wanted to. Yeah. No, that's really touching. Yeah. No, I mean, I can't say anything better than what he just said. It's you have a really wonderful way of speaking about things. Yeah, no, I'm glad that people can relate to that, because yeah, I felt very isolated, you know, and just thinking about what you just said about like the tax. I mean, yeah, I don't know. That's illuminating for me to think about, because you know, the tax for me, I guess, was like 15 years of just being like ignoring that whole like side of myself and choosing one side or the other to survive. And that's just a really, yeah, powerful way of saying that. Yeah.
Mehmet, Did you want to respond? I think we have about 5 more minutes and then we can open it up to questions.
Yeah, I think in my case also not having a community, an immediate community of my culture has been a reason behind me having to find new ways of connecting with the people around me and creating my own community. Because I think this is all about, you know, my practice as a seed keeper, as a farmer, and also my what I do for the university here. I think it's deeply rooted in community building. So so rather than, and again, the notion of Turkishness, I have a very strong Turkish identity, but then again, I oftentimes refer to you know, try to be careful about not to putting too much weight on my Turkishness when I refer to food that comes from my cultural background, because this oven, it's a community space, basically community builder, right? It doesn't only belong to, you know, the people who identify as Turks, or, you know, as Kurds, or, you know, as Armenians or Greeks, who, you know, people who live in the country. Because when you overdo that, then someone is going to just be confrontational or be upset and say that, you know, oh, I mean, this is actually not true. It's you know, this was in my village growing up, and, you know, in Eastern Turkey. And even in my case, I also feel more responsibility and accountability, because, especially because I grew up in a big city, and I shouldn't claim ownership on that cultural aspect of, very important cultural aspect of food. But see myself as I see myself as someone who is trying to make better connections with these scenes of food culture and communities. And it's true, if you look at pictures 40 years, 50 years back, where I grew up, the capital of Turkey, there are some pictures that you can find in where there is the main hubs of traffic, shepherds with sheep were passing through. So the developments in cities also, you know, were built around these rural spaces, right? It's not that old. Especially also thinking my you know, my parents' background to connection to land, because my dad was specifically born in a you know, back in time, quite rural part of the, although it was, you know, quote unquote a town, a kind of a rural space. So yeah, I think it's about creating my, and there's only, I think as far as I know, if it didn't change recently much, 400,000 Turks live in the United States. So, and then these are very scattered too. So other than that student experience in Michigan, nowadays it's getting more and more stronger. My connection with Turkish community across this country is happening through seeds. Someone, you know, a Turk who basically is deeply missing their stuffing peppers, so that they can make the traditional stuffed pepper recipe, seeing me stewarding that pepper, finds a way to, you know, connect with me, and then that's how the connection happens.
Michelle, do you want to bring in some of the voices from the Q&A?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all. What a rich discussion. Excellent questions. So yeah, we have one of the first questions we have that has come in from the audience sounds like it was sparked by Mehmet's earlier comments about maybe 12 minutes ago. And so this person notes that they're always curious about other cultures. They like to ask people questions about their cultures, especially about food traditions. but this person worries about that being taken as offensive or me being nosy. It sounds like sometimes those are very welcoming. This person says, is it nosy? Or is someone being open-minded and eager to learn? So how do you, whoever wants to comment on that, how would you feel about someone being a little hesitant about asking about food traditions and being nervous about being offensive or too nosy? Was I able to be heard? I'm sorry. I have a construction across the street. I'm sorry. Yeah, would anyone want to? Yeah, Jonathan.
You know, I think that's a very common question that I think a lot of people, especially people who come from backgrounds and experiences, like I don't want to speak for other people on the panel, but I get it as a Black person. I get this question a lot, right? Like, how do I like relate without, you know, falling into the traps, or not even traps, but like how do I relate without being offensive or saying the wrong thing, or, you know, all of that stuff. And you know, I think a lot of that is like the attitude with which you approach getting to know people and an identity. And it comes from, like, I think, you know, you're on the right track when you can say that you love a people or a person, and that person loves you back, and you know that, right? You don't have to ask the question, right, to yourself, like, you know that. You know, the people who I know, you know, like Mike and Amy and Mehmet and Emily, you know, like, I would feel confident of saying that, like, I am loved by them, and they love me. And Marlon, the only reason why I'm not including you is because, like, we haven't really met, but I kind of feel like we would be BFFs pretty quickly. And I think that you know, that comes from, like, the way that a person approaches getting to know a person or an identity. And when you approach that curiosity with the goal in mind of being in good relation and getting to a place of love, then you become inherently aware of the ways that those identities of the people that you seek to be in community with are marginalized and understood as people who don't live in that identity, right? So, like, if you really want to, like, get to know a Black person and want to be loved by a Black person, then you learn how Blackness is understood, like, more broadly, right? And so if you're a white person who's wanting to do that, then as a white person, you have to understand how your identity, your contrasting identity to the person you want, you know, like, shows up and is understood in that relationship, right? And so you learn, like, you know, if you're a white person who wants to get to know Black people, you learn the ways that, like, white people unintentionally or intentionally sort of, like, marginalize Blackness and say things that are really that are not okay. So, like, you do that work because you want to get to a place of love. So, you know, in a given moment, whether or not somebody's curiosity is taken as, like, genuine curiosity or offense depends on how that person is approaching the situation as from a place of love. And when people screw up, I think, is when, you know, they have this mindset of being, like, extractive, or thinking that you can build connection and make connection without having that mindset towards love, being loved and giving love, right? And, you know, I'll speak for myself, but I think this is the same for anyone who has a marginalized identity. You become very, very good at reading people's intentions very quickly. And so, because you have to, right? Because you have to avoid the situations where things are unpleasant, right? So, so with that in mind, I think it's important to, again, like, be genuine about going beyond just the bit of information that you want to get from somebody, and really being interested in the person, and then how that person understands their identity and their multiple identities, moving forward. So, I think that I do appreciate this question. And I think that it's important that I think as you get to a point where you understand what I'm trying to say as I'm rambling, like you ask that question less and less, right? You worry less and less about like being offensive, and really focus on understanding the identity and knowing that you're not going to bat 1,000, right? You're going to miss some stuff. But are you missing stuff in the process of getting to a point of love, or are you missing stuff because you just want to like signal that like, oh, I know about like, Turkish peppers, or, oh, I made kimchi once, and I want you to know that I know how that tastes. That's good, and I don't think it's nasty. Something like that, right? So, I think approaching it from a standpoint of wanting to love and wanting to be loved. Like, can you be claimed by the people that you want to be in community with is a really important metric. And it takes time, but there's a lot of delicious food along the way. So, yeah.
Does anyone else want to add anything? It also brings to mind, the issues around misappropriation of food traditions and misrepresentation as well. But shall we move on to the next question? Because we're getting there with time. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Thea Austin. She has another audience question.
Hi, yeah, everybody. Great conversation. This audience member wanted to say thank you so much for the series. Just wonderful, and particularly Marlon is a special favorite. And she said she wanted to hear what you all think. Do you think this series would be more impactful for fellow West Virginians or for people outside West Virginia? She says, or this person says, lots of othering happens on both levels. And this person is great for any positive impact the series had on either dynamic, and wondering what you think.
Well, I guess I could speak to at least some of this, as Amy and I can speak to it as the filmmakers, and I think that I don't think we have to pick necessarily, and I think that the answer in this case is both. I think especially given the venue here, the platform that it is, Library of Congress, it is for a national audience, but also all of the stories we tell are for us, for West Virginians. I think when we started this business, part of what drove it certainly was this decades and decades of, the buildup of seeing how West Virginia, how portrayed to, people outside the region, to people outside West Virginia. But I think the more we started doing it, it was like the value of the stories, like these are our stories. It is very valuable for us to be able to give people inspiration and agency to tell their own stories, to realize that this place is rich in stories and that we are empowered when we tell them ourselves. And when, that's a very different dynamic than, an outside, national media outlet dropping in, telling the stories about these 4 people would have looked very different, than if it were someone like us. So it is different, but I think at the end of the day, I just, as a storyteller, I just care a lot less these days about what people outside of West Virginia think about us. And I care a lot more about making people here feel like, these stories that we have are worthy, are, pride worthy, because I think in all of that sort of, decades of the way that West Virginia has been portrayed, there's been a lot of disempowerment through the stories, and a lot of sort of feeling like for one, we are unable to tell our own stories, that somebody else will always tell our stories for us, and that, you know, we have no control over the narrative. So that's just sort of my take on that is.
Yeah.
the-
Yeah, and the stories told are not always, they're not always true and authentic, and they're not always flattering. And so that's in large part internalized in the region. And I think a lot of what we do is kind of turn the narrative and speak to, you know, not the negative stereotypes that maybe is thought of nationally and internalized locally, but we try to get the story out there that is hopeful, is inspiring and empowering, and that we can, you know, we're perfectly capable of telling our story ourselves.
Okay, does anybody else want to respond, or we have one question? Okay, so one thing that was that came across in the was that not only are you practicing to use locally grown or locally sourced food to dishes, and we're wondering if you have that the impact on the environment of sourcing cooking locally rather than cooking with food that you bring in and with a huge carbon footprint.
I couldn't hear the question very well.
Yeah, I think the connection
sorry.
was kind of garbled. Yeah.
Were you able to that? Should I ask the question one more time?
You can try, but it sounds like you're asking about.
I'll try again. Okay, I'll try again. Mel, you have the question. Okay, I'll try it one more time. You guys, and let me know if you can hear it. You do a really great job showing how you all locally and grow and source it locally, practicing traditions that are very important to you, and using locally grown or locally sourced food to make traditional dishes. Have thought the impact on the environment of cooking locally as opposed to using things that you have to import, you know, movement of looking for local resources in order to.
It's still cutting out a lot. Is
I
the
think
question?
your connection is bad, Thea.
If you
so
can
do
type
you-
it in the
Yeah.
Q&A, that'd be
Well,
great.
she texted it to me, and so, okay. One thing that comes across, everyone can hear me? Okay, great, go Baltimore. Okay, one thing that comes across is that not only are you practicing your traditions, but all of you use locally grown or locally sourced food to make traditional dishes. Do you have thoughts about the impact of on the environment of sourcing locally to prepare your dishes, consume your dishes? So it sounds like it's a question on the, you know, environmental impacts, but locally.
Yeah, I think I'll just answer real quick that, you know, one of the things that got me into like foraging and I mean, particularly foraging and just like learning the names of plants that were around, I was just like baffled by how much free food was like available, right? It's like just growing for like the low price of free 99. And so, you know, then getting my PhD in ecology and, you know, learning about sustainability and these sorts of things from that angle, it was like, well, this just makes so much more sense to like walk out my door and like build a salad. Or go down to the pond or the river or something like that and catch some fish, or get out into the woods and like put meat in my freezer. And then having the language to be like, oh my goodness, like my, carbon footprint is so much less, if I'm eating locally. And, I think that is such an important aspect of the way that I approach food and the food traditions that I have. And it reminds me of the way that Monica White, who's a brilliant scholar at the University of Madison, wrote in her book Freedom Farmers, and about George Washington Carver, right, the famous scientist who's known for like the Peanut Man, right, but he's also largely responsible for like the locavore movement, and working with newly emancipated Black folks and having like an extension center through the Tuskegee Institute, right, Historical Black College, because all of these newly emancipated Black folks, they couldn't like go down to the university, the state university, and like talk to the white folks and get information about how to grow plants. So like he did that work and showed them how to use manure and for fertilizer and all these sorts of things. So I think that it's holistic when you kind of like focus on the impact that your food is making on the environment. You really begin to sort of see the entire scope of what it takes to put food on your plate. And the systems that have been built have designed us to be removed from that. And it becomes difficult for us to understand when like our food comes from a grocery store. Like, so why do I have to care about the impact of that? All I have to do is just go down to the grocery store. But when you are immersed in this and you're depending on your local environment, then it does all sorts of wonderful things to understanding the world that you live in. Not only like the environmental impact, but then like the sociological impact and the history that exists there. So yeah, I mean, it's central to that. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're over time, but we just got a flood of questions in the Q&A. How about I just ask one more? How's everyone feel about that? And this really speaks to Marlon's experience that she shared. How can we help kids connect to these ideas of connection to place and building community? So many students have the same experience of being even passively shamed for their different food ways, obviously beyond celebratory international days in schools that can reinforce the othering. So, in a way, how can we go beyond just these one-off, right, international food day celebrations and in building community with kids, and to fight against the shame and discrimination and dehumanization that they face? If anyone would like to chime in, or because in many ways it's been discussed, but
I want to talk, but I've been talking too much, so I'm gonna.
My kids just rushed in, so I'm trying to get them.
There you go.
So here they are, the kids. Yeah, and I was trying to reread it again, and it disappeared. Let me see.
Oh,
we're late on time.
1 second.
How do we help kids connect to these ideas of connection to place and building community? I think, this sounds a little silly, but I think, videos like this, things, telling other people's stories is a way to feel connected. Me just seeing more Asian stories in the media has made me feel like I've got a little bit more space to breathe, a little bit more room. So I think that that's one really important thing is storytelling. And, the way that we help get our kids connected is by just doing things with our community and gardening and kind of taking them through the process of food and things like that. I'm not sure, sorry.
Mehmet, would you want to add anything? Because we are now rounding out this fabulous discussion.
Yeah, I think community building has a lot to do with it, with other people. You know, I think I saw also in the questions about a question about internalization of the othering of West Virginians. Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, I reflect on my time here since we arrived in 2018, and I think we already do it in a non-extractive way by just, you know, cooking together, you know, with neighbors or sharing meals with neighbors. I think it always amuses me to see this delicacy, which is, you know, which is a delicacy in Turkey, which is beef cheeks. When I was looking for it here because I was craving it, there are specialty restaurants that cook beef cheeks in Turkey. So and if you think about it, it's a leftover part of the animal, right? It's quote unquote was considered a poor people's food because it was thrown once the entire animal is processed for its, again, quote unquote, valuable parts, who, you know, for people who could have afforded it. But then it became a big cooking tradition to basically prepare dishes out of these parts of the animal that's thrown away. So when I was looking for it, of course, I couldn't find it. And then our neighbor, without telling me, talked to the people in the slaughterhouse in the area. Again, the kindness in this, it's just, you know, it makes me all the time appreciate our neighbor because he just thought it was important for me. And he was also curious, the curiosity too. I mean, that's the sincere curiosity, because he was interested in what it could taste like. So he took out his time and then went to the slaughterhouse, and, you know, this is kind of graphic, but you know, he brought the cow heads and then to take the cheeks out, and then I cooked it, and then it became a huge deal. Now every once in a while they request that dish that, you know, I just make, just basically very simple, roasted in the oven. And I realized that actually we haven't made it in the brick oven yet. So this is a new request that our neighbor made the other day. I think we are going to try it in the oven. So yeah, I mean, I think trying to connect in meaningful ways while being also, you know, this is something that Jonathan and I have discussed a lot, not as an ally, but as an accomplice in sharing these cultural significances, right? How much, you know, how far are you willing to go for advocating these cultural traditions, because it always connects to place, identity, and race. You know, even if it looks like it's just this, you know, simply about food, you know, quote unquote. So yeah, I think I'm enjoying these lately, the shows that also that appears on you know, on some networks, just finding out, you know, especially made by people of color, and then also produced, you know, by other underrepresented, marginalized communities. So
And I'll just jump in real quick, and I'll say that, like, as it relates to children, I think it's really important that we are honest with them, because one of the things that I'm finding about the hard stuff about our lives and like the way things are structured, because one of the things I'm finding as somebody who teaches young adults in higher education, and we talk about, you know, like these problematic histories that have been hidden from, you know, most of us in our education, that they're mad, right? And like they're mad at the older generations. It was like, why didn't you teach us this, right? You know, like, why didn't you teach us that the Mayo Clinic was started by you know, harvesting the bones of indigenous men who were hanged in the Dakota Wars, the largest mass execution in the United States, that was signed by Abraham Lincoln, in the midst of the Civil War, right? So like these facts about history, like they want to know, and they're upset when they're like, how come nobody told me this? So I think it's really important to talk to our kids, the young people in our lives, not just like the ones who, you know, come from our bodies, but the young people that are around us, to like be honest about this, and to let them know that we will walk with them through this hard history, and that we're all learning and trying to do better, because nothing's going to get fixed, nothing's going to get better if we don't face, you know, these problematic structures. And you know, some of the biggest ones are white supremacy and patriarchy, right? So we have to be honest with our children about that, and not to be afraid about how that may make us look, but to be more to be courageous enough to see ourselves on the other side of that, right? So we need to talk to our kids like from a very young age, I think, from a very young age about these hard histories, and then they can be better prepared to like build community. So yeah.
Well, thank you. I think that's a beautiful note to end on. We are a little over time, so I'm going to just thank everyone for being here, for taking this time for this really rich discussion. It will be recorded and available on the Library of Congress website in due time. And of course, thank you to Mike and Amy and Emily for leading this discussion, and to all of our participants. On behalf of the American Folklife Center, it's been such an honor to work with you. I feel I can say that. So thank you, and sorry to rush you off. I wish we could talk all day.
Thank you all so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
So much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.